Hello, Dan Down here on behalf of the Wilderness Society. For issue 3 of our Wilderness Journal, I had the pleasure to speak with Dr. Cayne Layton about his groundbreaking research, which aims to restore the underwater wilderness of Tasmania's giant kelp forests that have largely been wiped out by the effects of climate change. Read the full story online, and if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to our New Look Wilderness Journal. Enjoy. What is your role and where is your research located, Cayne?
So my name is Dr. Cayne Layton. I'm a marine ecologist and a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies at the University of Tasmania in Hobart. And my research specialty and my research area is kelp forests, and particularly the ecology and the restoration of kelp forests.
Fantastic. And there's a terrible stat associated with these giant kelp forests. I think it's 95% of Tasmanian kelp has been lost in 40 years.
That's correct, yes. So 95% of Tasmanian giant kelp has been lost over the last several decades. And that's largely attributed to climate change and ocean warming.
And where is that damage located? Where is that loss happening?
So that 95% figure is from kind of the east coast and the southeast coast of Tasmania, but they're really the historical heartlands for giant kelp in Tasmania. There are smaller populations on the west coast of Tassie, giant kelp, and we don't really have a good understanding of what's happened with them due to climate change, just because it's quite a tough area to work in. But yeah, the losses primarily have been on the east and southeast coasts of Tassie, but like I said, that's the real kind of heartland. So those losses are really significant.
And just how are you aware of those losses? Is that mapping over the decades, or?
Yeah, that's right. So those losses have been calculated based on various types of mapping. In the early days, they were mostly aerial surveys. So some poor sod had to hang out of the side of a plane sketching or photographing these kelp canopies that float on the surface. And then in later, in more recent times, we've been able to also utilize some satellite imagery to kind of help add to that picture.
Fantastic. And you say it's climate change largely. And how is that? Is that just is that a bit like the barrier reef with just warming ocean temperatures and acidification?
Yes. So the loss of the giant kelp in Tassie is really attributed to climate change and specifically changing oceanography. And that's caused by the East Australian current, which is a warm, nutrient-poor current. And it's kind of flowing further south due to climate change than it did historically. And it's having a greater influence in Tasmania than it did historically. And it's displacing a lot of the water that was more kind of characteristic of Southern Ocean water, so cooler and nutrient-rich.
Yeah, okay. And just on a personal note, because you work with giant kelp so closely, have you felt a sense of despair and loss? I mean, it's a terrible kind of figure to be working with, 95% loss. So just wondering how you sort of personally felt with that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've heard it's actually becoming quite a topic of conversation amongst ecologists around the world, not just marine ecologists, but ecologists working in many environments that are suffering due to climate change. And they kind of call it, ecological grief. And there's this idea that in many ways, ecologists are kind of like the first responders to climate change. Take nothing away from the first responders to, obviously more, accidents and emergencies nowadays, but it's this idea that, these areas, these workers are really at the forefront and seeing the destruction, in a day-to-day, as part of their work. And I've certainly seen that here in Tassie. We've seen areas of dense giant kelp slowly thin out. We've seen areas, bays that used to have maybe small remnant patches of giant kelp basically have they have literally no giant kelp left, not a single individual. And that's in the span of time that I've been working in Tassie, which is only about the past 7 years.
Okay, and a giant kelp, are they particularly sensitive organisms to conditions changing?
Not necessarily. It seems to be that in Australia, they were kind of already close to their thermal limit. So giant kelp live around the world in places like Chile and the west coast of North America, so the US and Canada. And they'll grow to quite low temperatures. There's records of them growing in, places like Macquarie Island and some of the subantarctic islands at around, 2 and 3 and 4 degrees, which is very chilly, obviously. So it seems to be that it's not necessarily that they're more sensitive to it, and that they have a narrower kind of thermal range. It's just that they were already kind of close to their limit in Australia as it was.
Sure. And are those, something I've wondered, are those Californian and Chilean kelp, giant kelp, are they the same species that we have here in Australia?
Yeah, yep, exactly the same species. So in Australia, Tassie's the real heartland for giant kelp. It does occur to a lesser extent in patches in Victoria and South Australia, but giant kelp also does occur elsewhere in the world, like I said.
And they're called kelp forests, and they appear to be actually similar to sort of terrestrial forests. They have an understory and things like that. So can you tell me a bit about what makes these kelp forests unique and how they work as an environment?
Yes, so kelp forests really are just underwater forests. I mean, everything you think about a forest on land, there's the equivalent under the water. So there's, these kelp that form these big dense canopies. There's understory layers. There's different layers within the canopy. There's different animals and other species of seaweed that utilize different areas within that canopy and within that vertical space. The same way when you walk through a forest on land, the environment changes. So it can be darker under there, or there might be less wind. It's exactly the same under the water in kelp forests. So that canopy again creates a lot of shade. So within a kelp forest underwater, it's darker. There's less current. So it's exactly the same comparison, really. It's an environment that creates a lot of physical complexity, but they also kind of modify the physical conditions, and that has impacts on the species that live in and around these forests.
And what kind of animals or other organisms rely on kelp forests like this?
Yes, so kelp forests are so kind of ubiquitous and widespread in southern Australia, in temperate Australia, that basically any animal that you can think of, that most of us can think of, that live in our cold water environments, either live in or rely on kelp forests. So I'm talking about weedy sea dragons. I'm talking about seals. Some of the really big species of fish, snapper, bream. They all live within kelp. Giant cuttlefish. The largest cuttlefish in the world can grow, longer than a metre. It's found only in southern Australia, and they live in and around kelp forests. So really incredibly important environments, not only for the species the species that live in them, but also the fact that they support a lot of species in Australia that live nowhere else in the world.
Well, it's amazing about the cuttlefish. And how important are kelp forests in terms of acting as carbon sinks? Can they even be used to slow and mitigate climate change if we maintain them and look after them?
Yeah, so this area of kind of study and this theme of kelp as carbon sinks is actually quite an emerging area of research, and something that's attracting increasing popularity. I guess there's two parts to carbon storage. One is how much carbon is absorbed by an organism, whether that's a redwood or a giant kelp. But there's also the other part of the equation is how and where is that carbon stored? And that's the real secret. Because you can absorb heaps of it, but if you're not storing it anywhere, then you're obviously not having that much of an impact on overall emissions, and I guess overall acting as a sink for carbon. So we know that kelp forests absorb a lot of carbon. So we have that kind of part of the question worked out, or at least better understood. The issue we're still working at the moment is that storage question. We know that a lot of kelp is transported to the deep ocean, which is really good because the kelp there the carbon in the kelp gets locked up in the deep ocean. And, a lot of kelp also gets transported to coastal sediments. So that might be like the beach next to the kelp forest, or the seagrass meadow next to the kelp forest. So we think a lot of the carbon that's absorbed does get locked up in long-term kind of areas of storage, but we're still trying to figure out exactly for how long, exactly how much.
Well, it's interesting that we have another method of trying to store carbon and
Yeah, that's right. Again, I mean, the analogy with terrestrial forests is very apt. So it's all that carbon storage, it's all that biomass, it's all that life. But yeah, there's a really potentially important avenue, I guess, for carbon sequestration and carbon storage.
fantastic. And kelp forests, they go unseen. I mean, it's hard. It must be hard to raise awareness of their plight because they're kind of out of sight and out of mind unless you are diving diving in some pretty deep water. So has it been hard to sort of get that message out there that there's been a terrible loss of these kelp forests?
Yeah, I think the marine environment at large suffers very much from that kind of out of sight, out of mind mentality. Luckily in Tassie, the giant kelp has quite an iconic place in kind of the psyche of people and the psyche of the state and the marine environment. So, you know, considering it's just seaweed and not a lot of people are interested in seaweed, there is actually quite a lot of engagement and interest in our work and in the loss of giant kelp. Also, the fact that we lost them so quickly. You know, there's many, many members of the public that remember how the environment used to be, remember what it used to look like. And that's really important for harnessing kind of community spirit and community, you know, action, I guess, and community interest in projects is because there is that collective knowledge and that social knowledge of what an area used to look like. But yeah, on the whole, we do struggle with getting kind of attention in marine environments and for seaweed, you know, because it does kind of have a bit of a bad name, I guess.
Sure. And you mentioned how these forests used to look. Are there any remaining tracts of healthy giant kelp forest left?
Yeah, there are. So in kind of the very southern parts of Tassie, there are some still really dense, healthy forests. They've suffered and retracted nonetheless. You know, they're not as healthy as they used to be, but there are some areas where divers can access it are still very much representative of what these thick, healthy, you know, giant kelp forests used to look like.
And I imagine you've dived in those healthy areas of giant kelp.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe what that's like, diving through essentially, yeah, as we've described, a tall forest?
Yeah, in some ways it's more, I find the giant kelp specifically, it's quite a stringy kind of, it grows in quite a stringy form. So I think it's kind of almost more akin to an underwater jungle than an underwater forest with all the vines and the lianas. But, you know, it grows so thick in places that you physically can't swim through it. So it's almost like navigating a maze and finding your way through. It can be really, really dark because that forest canopy blocks out a lot of the light. But then you also have this sensation, because obviously you're swimming through a 3D space, it kind of feels like you're flying on occasion because you can obviously move up and down and left to right, whereas when you walk through a forest on land, obviously you're stuck on the ground. So yeah, they're really, really magical environments to dive in, not only just because of that sense of space and that 3D kind of verticality to them and the height, but also the fact that, yeah, they can be really dark and impenetrable and, yeah, just very magical environments, the way the light filters through in certain parts.
Fantastic. And it seems like an insurmountable challenge to bring these forests back. How is your research going to help with that?
Look, it is a really big challenge, and our project at the moment is about laying kind of a foundation of knowledge about how we can potentially move forward to restore some of these giant kelp forests. A really important aspect of restoration, of habitat restoration, is you have to kind of address or at least understand the reason or the cause of the initial cause of the decline of the habitat. So for giant kelp forests in Tassie, like I said, that's ocean warming. That's obviously not something we can solve in the short term because it's linked to climate change and carbon emissions. So what we're doing is we're looking for giant kelp that exists from that kind of remaining 5%. We're looking for individuals in the population that are just naturally more tolerant to warm water. So exactly the same way that some humans are taller than others, some giant kelp are just naturally more tolerant of warm water. So we've gone out and sampled from that remaining 5% all the way across Tassie, from the north to the south, multiple populations, and we can test them here in the lab at the university. And we've identified individuals or families that are more tolerant of warm water. and then we can breed them in the lab, and they're the ones that we can outplant. So the idea is that we give them a bit of a leg up, and we what they call future-proof. So we future-proof them, and kind of we planting kelp that are more adapted to modern conditions.
And how long has it taken you to get to this stage?
Yeah, so it's quite a slow process, making sure that everything's done, really methodically and slowly. And we're also restricted often by the seasonality of kelp and the reproductive cycle, which is in Tassie, the reproductive peak for giant kelp is in winter. So we're often winter's a really crazy period for us, often lots of diving, sometimes in the snow and the sleet. Obviously, we've been impacted this winter because of COVID, just like many people around the world, around Australia. So we kind of lost our opportunity this year, unfortunately, to really get out and start working in the peak period. But so far, it's taken us about 18 months to sample from those remaining giant kelp and identify those more tolerant giant kelp, or the super kelp, we call them. And then the plan is now, within the next few weeks, we'll be out planting a lot of these into 3 test sites, and then to really try and get a better understanding of whether or not we can grow and create these really dense, healthy patches of giant kelp before we then move onwards at looking at maybe upscaling and putting more of these patches in.
Fantastic. And imagine it's, if all goes well, you're then looking at kind of coast-wide scale regeneration. How do you think you'll be able to tackle a project on that scale?
Yeah, that's right. So, we've lost giant kelp at the scale of the Tasmanian coast. So to have some positive impact on the environment at that scale, clearly we have to get restoration happening on that type of geographic scale. The problem often with marine restoration is that it's very resource intensive, and for it to work at the scale of somewhere like Tassie, it can't just be me and my colleagues going out planting giant kelp. So there's kind of 2 aspects we're hoping to use to solve that problem. One of which is the idea behind planting these little dense, healthy patches of giant kelp is that they become not only self-sustaining, but also self-expanding. So restoration is kind of about kickstarting a natural process for kelp forests, at least. So kickstarting that patch and getting that little patch of giant kelp happy and healthy enough that then it can release its own spores and expand on its own accord. The other option is, once we've kind of figured out our methods and how to plant those giant kelp into these dense, healthy patches, we're just going to share that information and that knowledge with as many people as possible. Hopefully start forming some really valuable partnerships with Indigenous Tasmanian organisations, local fishers, governments, councils, to just get as many individuals and groups out there planting patches as we can. And the idea, obviously, the more patches we can get at the scale of the coast, that's going to help us with our restoration efforts.
I imagine that having healthy kelp forests also increases the fish stocks for fishing communities as well.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. So, giant kelp create habitat for a whole bunch of different species. Luckily in Tasmania, when we lose the giant kelp, it gets replaced by another species of kelp called common kelp. And it always occurred in Tassie as well. It used to just occur side by side with the giant kelp, whereas it's kind of the dominant kelp in Tasmania now. And it's far more tolerant of warm water, which is why it hasn't been affected as much. Although this species is much shorter, it's only about 1 metre or so tall. So, that difference in size from the giant kelp, which might be 20 or 30 or 40 metres tall, you've obviously lost something very special, and the environments are quite different. But at the moment, those common kelp forests are still really productive, still really important, and they really support a lot of our coastal fisheries and also industries as well, like our abalone industry, our rock lobster fishery.
And so in the midterm, communities could be able to assist with the replanting effort. Is there anything that the public can help you with in the short term?
Unfortunately, it's difficult to get involved in a lot of our fieldwork research just because of obviously university and workplace regulations and insurance. But the best kind of avenue at the moment is to help us identify and locate a lot of these patches of giant kelp. We've lost so much of it that it can be difficult to physically go out and study and find where these remaining patches are. So we've launched an app called Kelp Tracker, And the idea is that any waterway user, if you're a paddler, if you're a recreational fisher, commercial fisher, whoever, they can just take a photo of the kelp for us. They can log it onto a map with a GPS location. They can tell us kind of some rough characteristics of it. Is it healthy? Is it sick? Is it in deep water, shallow water? And then we can, use all of those observations from all of the citizen scientists across the state to get a better understanding of where the kelp is. And then it really helps us study the giant kelp and some of these remnant patches. And that's really the best avenue at the moment for people that want to get involved.
Great. I'll have to download the app myself if I
Cool.
get down to Tasmania. What hope do you have for the future of giant kelp, as well as rehabilitating the habitat? Does that go hand in hand with mitigating climate change to ensure the biodiversity that the Tassie East Coast is famous for?
Yeah, 100%. So, we're really encouraged by the fact that our work has identified these strains of super kelp that are more tolerant, and that's going to allow us to plant kelp that are more future-proof. But the reality is it's really just a buying time exercise. The crux of it all is we have to get a handle on carbon emissions and climate change. And, our restoration efforts at the moment are hopefully going to, like I said, buy us a bit of time before we do that. But ultimately, it's climate change that we've got to solve.
Great. Thank you for talking to us, Dr. Layton. And it's been very interesting. And keep up the good work.
Thank you. My pleasure.